Sarah Martinez never imagined that her job as a court reporter would put her life in danger. For 12 years, she had sat quietly in courtrooms across San Diego, typing away as lawyers argued cases and judges made decisions. She was invisible, professional, and dedicated to her work. But everything changed on a cold Tuesday morning in March when she was assigned to cover the trial of Vincent Viper Castellano, a notorious gang leader accused of multiple murders. The courtroom was packed with reporters, family members of victims, and law enforcement officers. Sarah took her usual position near the judge's bench, her fingers ready to capture every word. As the prosecution began presenting their case, she noticed the defendant's cold, calculating eyes scanning the room. When those eyes met hers, she felt a chill run down her spine. There was something predatory about his gaze, something that made her skin crawl. The trial proceeded for 3 weeks, and Sarah documented every testimony, every piece of evidence, and every legal argument. The prosecution's case was strong, built on witness testimony from former gang members who had turned against Castellano. Sarah watched as witness after witness took the stand, their voices shaking as they described the brutal crimes they had witnessed. She typed their words, knowing that her transcript would be crucial for any appeals process. During the second week of the trial, Sarah began to notice things that made her uncomfortable. A black sedan would follow her car on her way home from court. When she stopped at the grocery store, she would see the same man in a leather jacket watching her from across the parking lot. At first, she thought she was being paranoid, but the feeling of being watched became constant and overwhelming. One evening, as Sarah was leaving the courthouse after a particularly intense day of testimony, she found a note tucked under her windshield wiper. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the piece of paper and read the words written in block letters. Stop typing or stop breathing. Your choice. The message was clear and terrifying. Someone wanted her to stop doing her job, to somehow sabotage the trial transcript. Sarah immediately called the police, but Detective Mike Rodriguez, who took her statement, seemed skeptical. Court reporters get threatened sometimes, he said, his tone suggesting this was routine. These gang cases bring out the worst in people. We'll increase patrols in your neighborhood, but there's not much else we can do with just a note. But Sarah knew this was different. This wasn't just an empty threat from someone angry about a verdict. This was calculated intimidation from people who understood exactly how important accurate court transcripts were to the justice system. Without her precise record of the proceedings, appeals could be overturned, evidence could be questioned, and guilty verdicts could be thrown out. The threats escalated quickly. The next morning, Sarah found her car tires slashed. 2 days later, someone broke into her apartment while she was at work, destroying her furniture and spray painting "Last Warning" on her bedroom wall. The message was becoming clearer. Stop doing your job accurately or face the consequences. Sarah lived alone in a small apartment complex in downtown San Diego. Her parents lived across the country in Ohio, and she had few close friends in the city. She had always been independent, proud of her ability to take care of herself, but now she felt completely vulnerable and alone. Every shadow seemed threatening. Every unfamiliar sound made her heart race. The breaking point came on a Friday evening. Sarah was working late at the courthouse, finishing up the day's transcript, when she heard footsteps in the hallway outside the court reporter's office. The building should have been empty except for security guards, but these footsteps were deliberate and purposeful. She quietly locked her office door and called security, but no one answered. The footsteps stopped right outside her door. Sarah held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure whoever was outside could hear it. Then, she heard the sound of metal on metal. Someone was trying to pick the lock. She grabbed her cell phone and dialed 911, whispering her location to the dispatcher. The police arrived 15 minutes later, but whoever had been outside her door was gone. The only evidence was scratches around the lock mechanism, proof that someone had indeed tried to break into her office. This time, Detective Rodriguez took the threat more seriously. You need protection, he said. This has gone beyond simple intimidation. But the police department was stretched thin, dealing with multiple gang-related crimes across the city. They could offer some additional patrols, but they couldn't provide round-the-clock protection for a court reporter. We'll do what we can, Rodriguez promised. But Sarah could see the doubt in his eyes. They were fighting a war against organized crime with limited resources, and she was just one potential victim among many. That weekend, Sarah barely slept. Every car that drove past her apartment, every footstep in the hallway, every creak of the old building made her jump. She was exhausted, terrified, and beginning to wonder if she should just quit her job and leave San Diego. But she also knew that running away wouldn't solve the problem. These people had made it personal, and they wouldn't stop just because she quit. On Sunday evening, as Sarah was trying to figure out what to do next, her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something made her answer it. Sarah Martinez? The voice was deep, calm, and somehow reassuring. My name is James Thompson. I'm a friend of Detective Rodriguez. He told me about your situation, and I think I can help. James explained that he was a retired Navy SEAL who now worked in private security. Detective Rodriguez had mentioned Sarah's case to him, knowing that the police department couldn't provide the level of protection she needed. I've dealt with situations like this before, James said. People who threaten civilians to interfere with the justice system. They're cowards who prey on innocent people, but they can be stopped. Sarah was skeptical at first. She had never heard of private security for court reporters, and she certainly couldn't afford to hire a bodyguard. But James quickly put her concerns to rest. I'm not asking for payment, he said. I do this because I believe in justice, and because I can't stand bullies who threaten innocent people. All I ask is that you trust me and follow my instructions. They arranged to meet the next morning at a coffee shop near the courthouse. Sarah spent the night wondering if she was making the right decision. Could she really trust a stranger to protect her? What did she know about this James Thompson except that he claimed to be a retired SEAL? But as she lay awake listening to every sound in the building, she realized she didn't have many other options. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early, her nerves on edge. She had barely touched her coffee when a man approached her table. He was tall and lean, with short gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. His presence was somehow both calming and intimidating, like a coiled spring that could explode into action at any moment. Sarah? He asked, and when she nodded, he sat down across from her. I know you're scared, and you have every right to be. But I want you to know that from this moment forward, you're not alone in this fight. James spoke quietly but with absolute confidence. He had spent 22 years in the Navy SEALs, he explained, deployed all over the world in situations where failure meant death. He had been trained to protect people, to neutralize threats, and to never back down from a fight. After retiring from the military, he had worked with law enforcement agencies to protect witnesses and others who were threatened by criminal organizations. The people threatening you think they're sending a message, James said. They want to show that they can reach anyone, anywhere, and that the justice system can't protect the people who serve it. But they've made a mistake. They've threatened someone under my protection now, and I take that very personally. Sarah felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in weeks. This man radiated competence and determination in a way that made her believe he could actually keep her safe. But she also wondered what she was getting herself into. What exactly are you proposing? She asked. I'm going to make sure you can do your job safely, James replied. I'll escort you to and from the courthouse. I'll secure your apartment, and I'll be watching for anyone who tries to threaten you again. But more than that, I'm going to send a message back to whoever is behind this. They need to understand that threatening innocent civilians has consequences. As they talked, Sarah noticed that James was constantly scanning the coffee shop, his eyes moving systematically from table to table, entrance to exit, always aware of his surroundings. It was like he had a sixth sense for potential threats. She also noticed the way other customers seemed to unconsciously give him more space, as if they could sense that he was someone not to be trifled with. What happens if they escalate? Sarah asked. What if they don't back down? James looked directly into her eyes, his expression serious but not unkind. Then, they'll discover why people fear Navy SEALs, he said simply. I've spent my entire adult life learning how to protect the innocent and stop the guilty. I didn't retire from that mission when I left the military. Sarah felt a chill at his words, but it wasn't the same kind of fear she had been living with for weeks. This was different. It was the realization that she was now under the protection of someone truly dangerous, someone who had dedicated his life to fighting the kind of people who were threatening her. They spent the next hour going over the details of her daily routine, the layout of the courthouse, and the specifics of the threats she had received. James asked detailed questions about everything from her parking habits to her grocery shopping schedule. He was thorough and professional, treating her safety like a military operation that required careful planning and precise execution. When they were done, James walked Sarah to her car, his eyes constantly moving, assessing potential threats. "From now on," he said, "you don't go anywhere alone. If you need to change your routine for any reason, you call me first. And if you see anything that doesn't feel right, anything at all, you contact me immediately." As Sarah drove to work that morning, she felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks, a sense of security. She still didn't fully understand what she had gotten herself into, but she knew that someone capable and determined was now standing between her and the people who wanted to hurt her. The question was whether James Thompson would be enough to protect her from the full fury of a criminal organization that had already shown it would stop at nothing to get what it wanted. The next few days passed quietly, almost too quietly. James had arranged to meet Sarah every morning at 7:30 in the courthouse parking garage. He would escort her to her office, check the building for any signs of tampering or surveillance, and then position himself strategically where he could monitor anyone entering or leaving the courthouse. Sarah began to notice things about James that she hadn't seen in their first meeting. The way he moved with complete silence, how he seemed to anticipate potential problems before they developed, and the subtle hand signals he used with courthouse security guards who clearly knew and respected him. Vincent Castellano's trial was entering its final phase, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The prosecution had presented a devastating case, with witness after witness detailing the defendant's involvement in multiple murders, drug trafficking, and witness intimidation. Sarah typed every word, knowing that her transcript was creating an unshakable record that would be nearly impossible for Castellano's expensive legal team to overturn on appeal. She noticed that Castellano himself had become more agitated as the trial progressed. He would whisper angrily to his attorneys, slam his hands on the defense table when objections were overruled, and occasionally turn to stare at members of the jury with an intensity that made everyone in the courtroom uncomfortable. During one particularly damaging piece of testimony, Sarah saw him look directly at her, drawing his finger across his throat in a gesture that made her blood run cold. That afternoon, James was waiting for Sarah in the parking garage as usual, but his demeanor was different. His jaw was set, his eyes were harder than usual, and she could sense a controlled anger radiating from him. "We need to talk," he said simply, guiding her to his vehicle instead of her own car. As they drove through downtown San Diego, James explained what he had discovered through his contacts in law enforcement and the military intelligence community. "Castellano's organization has put a $50,000 bounty on you," he said, his voice calm despite the explosive nature of the information. "They want you dead or permanently disabled before the trial ends. They've hired professional criminals from Los Angeles, people who specialize in making problems disappear." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. This was no longer about intimidation or trying to scare her into making mistakes in her court transcripts. These people wanted her dead. "Why?" she whispered. "I'm just doing my job." "Because your job is destroying their case," James replied. "Every accurate word you type, every precise record you create, makes it harder for them to find grounds for appeal. You're not just a court reporter to them. You're the person documenting their leader's path to life in prison." James had spent the previous 2 days conducting what he called reconnaissance, surveillance, and intelligence gathering that revealed the full scope of the threat against Sarah. Using contacts from his military days who now worked in various law enforcement agencies, he had learned that Castellano's organization was more sophisticated and dangerous than anyone had realized. "They've been planning this for weeks," James continued. "They have your home address, your daily schedule, your vehicle information, even the names and addresses of your family members in Ohio. This isn't amateur hour. These are professionals who have killed witnesses before." The vehicle James was driving was not the same car Sarah had seen him in previously. This was a modified SUV with bulletproof glass, run-flat tires, and communication equipment that looked like something from a spy movie. James explained that he had called in favors from former military colleagues who now worked in private security, assembling a level of protection normally reserved for heads of state or high-value witnesses in federal cases. They drove to a safe house that James had arranged in a residential neighborhood about 20 miles from downtown San Diego. The house looked ordinary from the outside, but Sarah quickly realized it had been carefully chosen and modified for security. The windows had been replaced with bulletproof glass, security cameras covered every angle of approach, and the basement had been converted into a command center with multiple computer monitors and communication equipment. "This is where you'll be staying until the trial is over," James said. "I know it's not ideal, but it's the safest option we have." Sarah looked around the house, trying to process the reality of her situation. 3 weeks ago, she had been a normal person with a normal job, worried about nothing more serious than meeting deadlines and paying bills. Now she was hiding in a safe house, protected by a former Navy SEAL, because professional killers wanted her dead. "How long can this go on?" she asked. "Even if we get through the trial, what happens after Castellano is convicted? Won't his organization still want revenge?" James sat down across from her at the kitchen table, his expression serious but reassuring. "That depends on how we handle the next few days," he said. "If we just hide and wait for the trial to end, you're right, this could follow you for years. But if we send the right kind of message, if we show them that threatening you was the biggest mistake they ever made, then this ends permanently." Over the next several hours, James explained his plan. Instead of simply protecting Sarah defensively, he intended to go on the offensive against the people who were threatening her. Using intelligence-gathering techniques he had learned during his military career, he would identify the specific individuals who had been hired to kill her, locate their base of operations, and neutralize the threat at its source. "I'm not talking about vigilante justice," James clarified when he saw the concern in Sarah's eyes. "I'm talking about gathering evidence, working with law enforcement, and making sure these people face consequences for their actions. But I'm also talking about making it clear that anyone who threatens you in the future will have to deal with me personally." That evening, as Sarah tried to adjust to her new surroundings, James left the safe house to begin what he called target acquisition. He had identified 3 professional criminals who had been hired to kill Sarah, all of whom had arrived in San Diego from Los Angeles in the past week. Using surveillance techniques and intelligence sources, he intended to track their movements, identify their plans, and gather evidence of their criminal intent. Sarah spent the night in the safe house feeling like she was living in someone else's life. The house was comfortable but sterile, equipped with everything she needed but feeling nothing like home. She tried to focus on preparing for the next day's court session, but her mind kept wandering to the realization that people were actively planning to kill her. The next morning, James returned to the safe house with information that made Sarah's blood run cold. The 3 hired killers had conducted their own surveillance of her apartment, her workplace, and her daily routine. They had photographs of her, detailed schedules of her movements, and plans for an attack that was supposed to happen that very day. "They were going to hit you in the courthouse parking garage this afternoon," James explained. 2 of them would create a distraction while the third one approached your car. It would have looked like a carjacking gone wrong, just another random crime in a busy city. But James had turned the tables on them. Instead of being the hunters, they were now being hunted. Using skills developed during 22 years of military operations, he had tracked them to a motel room where they were staying, identified their vehicle, and even managed to plant listening devices that allowed him to monitor their conversations. "They don't know that we know about their plan," James said. "They think they still have the element of surprise. But we're going to use that against them." James had already contacted Detective Rodriguez and federal law enforcement agents who were working on the Castellano case. With evidence of the murder plot, they could arrest the 3 hired killers and potentially flip them to testify against whoever had hired them. But James wanted to do more than just arrest these particular criminals. He wanted to send a message that would prevent future threats against Sarah. "Here's what's going to happen," James explained as they drove toward the courthouse that morning. "You're going to court as usual, and I'm going to be watching for their attack. But instead of letting them make the first move, we're going to control the situation from beginning to end." Sarah felt her stomach twist with anxiety. The thought of using herself as bait for professional killers went against every instinct for self-preservation she possessed. But James explained the plan with such confidence and attention to detail that she found herself trusting his expertise despite her fears. The plan involved coordination with courthouse security, local police, and federal agents who would be positioned throughout the parking garage and surrounding area. Sarah would follow her normal routine, but every step would be monitored and controlled. The hired killers would be allowed to begin their attack, but they would be arrested before they could harm anyone. As they approached the courthouse, James's radio crackled with updates from the surveillance team. Target 1 is in position near the south entrance. Target 2 is in a black sedan on the third level of the parking garage. Target 3 is on foot, approaching from the east side. Sarah's heart was pounding as she parked her car in its usual spot on the second level of the garage. She could see James in her rearview mirror, maintaining his distance but ready to intervene if anything went wrong. She knew that law enforcement officers were positioned throughout the area, but she couldn't see them, which meant the hired killers probably couldn't see them either. As Sarah gathered her briefcase and prepared to leave her car, she saw a man approaching from about 50 feet away. He was walking casually, but there was something purposeful about his movement that made her skin crawl. This was one of the people who had been hired to kill her, someone who viewed her death as nothing more than a business transaction. The man continued approaching, and Sarah could see that he had his hand inside his jacket, presumably reaching for a weapon. This was it, the moment when weeks of threats and intimidation would either end in violence or be stopped by James's carefully planned intervention. What happened next unfolded so quickly that Sarah barely had time to process it. The man pulled a gun from his jacket and began moving toward her car more aggressively. But before he could take more than 3 steps, James appeared seemingly out of nowhere, moving with a speed and silence that was almost supernatural. James struck the gunman from behind, disarming him and putting him on the ground in one fluid motion. At the same time, law enforcement officers emerged from concealment throughout the parking garage, surrounding the other 2 hired killers before they could react to their partner's capture. Within minutes, all 3 men were in custody, their weapons confiscated, and their plan to kill Sarah completely dismantled. But James wasn't finished. As the arrested killers were being processed, he approached each of them with a message that would be relayed back to anyone else who might consider threatening Sarah in the future. "You made a mistake coming after someone under my protection," he told them, his voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable threat. "And if anyone else from your organization or any other organization even thinks about threatening this woman again, they'll answer to me personally. I want you to make sure that message gets delivered clearly." The lead killer, a man with multiple arrests for violence and intimidation, looked at James with a mixture of fear and respect. "Who the hell are you?" he asked. James smiled, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "I'm someone who spent 22 years learning how to find people who threaten innocent civilians," he said. "And I'm very good at my job." As the 3 hired killers were taken away in police vehicles, Sarah felt a sense of relief that she hadn't experienced in weeks. The immediate threat to her life had been neutralized, but she also understood that this was just the beginning of a larger confrontation between James and the criminal organization that had targeted her. The arrest of the 3 hired killers sent shockwaves through Vincent Castellano's criminal organization, but it also escalated the situation in ways that neither Sarah nor James had fully anticipated. Within 24 hours of the arrests, James received intelligence from his law enforcement contacts that Castellano's lieutenants were planning a much larger and more violent response to what they saw as an unacceptable interference in their operations. "They're not backing down," James explained to Sarah as they met in the safe house the morning after the parking garage arrests. "If anything, they're doubling down. They've put word out on the street that they'll pay $100,000 to anyone who can eliminate both of us." The trial was scheduled to continue for another week, with closing arguments and jury deliberation still to come. Sarah had hoped that the arrest of the hired killers would end the threats against her, but she was beginning to understand that she had become a symbol in a much larger conflict between the justice system and organized crime. James had spent the night analyzing intelligence reports and consulting with federal agents who were now taking a much more active interest in the case. The attempted murder of a court reporter had elevated the situation from a local gang matter to a federal investigation involving witness intimidation, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice. "Here's what we know," James said, spreading photographs and documents across the table in the safe house. Castellano's organization has connections to criminal networks in Los Angeles, Las Vegas, and Mexico. They've called in favors from all of those places, and we're now dealing with a coordinated effort to eliminate you before the trial ends. Sarah studied the photographs of men who wanted her dead. Some were gang members with tattoos covering their faces and arms. Others looked like ordinary businessmen who could blend into any crowd. The diversity of the threat was terrifying. These weren't just street criminals. They were part of a sophisticated network that had resources, connections, and experience in eliminating people who interfered with their operations. "What are our options?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear that was threatening to overwhelm her. James looked at her with the same calm confidence he had shown from the beginning. But Sarah could see something new in his eyes, a cold determination that suggested he was prepared to escalate his response to match the increased threat. "We have two options," he said. "Option one is that we put you in federal witness protection immediately. You disappear, get a new identity, and spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder. The trial continues without you, but any appeal will focus on your sudden disappearance and the questions it raises about the integrity of the court record." Sarah felt her heart sink. She had built a life in San Diego, established a career she was proud of, and developed relationships with colleagues and friends. The idea of abandoning everything and becoming someone else was almost as terrifying as the threats against her life. "What's option two?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. James's expression became even more serious. "Option two is that we end this permanently. We identify everyone who is threatening you. We gather evidence of their criminal activities, and we make sure they face consequences that are severe enough to deter future threats. But that means staying and fighting instead of running." Sarah understood what James wasn't saying directly. Option two meant that he would use his military training and special operations expertise to wage a campaign against the criminal organization that was threatening her. It meant turning the tables completely, making the hunters become the hunted. That afternoon, while Sarah attended court under heavy security, James began implementing what he called offensive operations. Using contacts from his military career who now worked in intelligence and law enforcement, he began systematically gathering information about every member of Castellano's organization who was involved in the threats against Sarah. The federal agents working the case had given James access to surveillance resources that were normally reserved for national security operations. Phone intercepts, financial records, travel documents, and surveillance footage from across multiple cities began painting a picture of a criminal network that was much larger and more sophisticated than local law enforcement had realized. James discovered that the threats against Sarah were part of a broader pattern. Castellano's organization had been intimidating and occasionally killing court officials, witnesses, and prosecutors for years. Sarah wasn't their first target, and she wouldn't be their last unless someone stopped them decisively. "They've been getting away with this for too long," James explained to Sarah that evening. "They think court officials are soft targets who can be intimidated or eliminated without serious consequences. They're about to learn how wrong they are." James had identified 12 individuals who were directly involved in the plot to kill Sarah, including several who had arrived in San Diego from other cities in the past few days. Using surveillance techniques he had perfected during military operations in hostile environments, he began tracking their movements, monitoring their communications, and gathering evidence of their criminal activities. The breakthrough came when James intercepted a phone conversation between two of Castellano's lieutenants discussing a plan to attack the courthouse directly. They weren't content with trying to kill Sarah in the parking garage. They wanted to send a message by carrying out a violent assault during court proceedings. "They're planning to hit the courthouse tomorrow during closing arguments," James told Sarah as they reviewed the intercepted communications. "Multiple gunmen, diversionary explosives, and a direct assault on the courtroom where you're working." This was no longer about intimidating a single court reporter. This was about a criminal organization declaring war on the entire justice system. But James was ready for them. Working with federal agents, local police, and courthouse security, James developed a comprehensive defense plan that would protect Sarah and everyone else in the courthouse while simultaneously capturing or neutralizing the attackers. But, more importantly, he was going to ensure that this was the last time anyone from Castellano's organization would threaten an innocent civilian. The morning of the planned attack, Sarah arrived at the courthouse to find it transformed into what looked like a fortress. Federal agents in tactical gear were positioned at every entrance. Snipers were on surrounding buildings, and the entire area for 6 blocks around the courthouse had been quietly evacuated of civilians. This ends today, James told Sarah as he escorted her to the courtroom. One way or another, the threats against you stop permanently. The courthouse attack began exactly as James's intelligence had predicted. At 10:30 in the morning, just as the prosecution was beginning its closing argument, explosions echoed from the parking garage beneath the building. Smoke began filtering into the courthouse, and armed men began moving toward the main entrances. But instead of finding an unprepared courthouse full of soft targets, the attackers encountered a coordinated response from dozens of federal agents and local police officers who had been waiting for them. The assault was over in less than 15 minutes, with 8 attackers dead and 4 others in custody. James had positioned himself in the courtroom balcony, where he could protect Sarah if any of the attackers managed to reach the courtroom itself. But his primary focus was on a different target, Vincent Castellano himself. During the confusion of the attack, James had noticed Castellano communicating with someone using hand signals that were clearly prearranged. With federal agents focused on the external threat, James was able to monitor Castellano's communications and confirm that he was directing the assault from inside the courtroom. "He's coordinating the attack," James whispered into his radio, providing federal agents with real-time intelligence about Castellano's role in the courthouse assault. "He's using hand signals to communicate with someone outside the building." This evidence of Castellano directing the attack while he was supposed to be a defendant in his own trial provided federal prosecutors with additional charges that would ensure he never saw freedom again, regardless of the outcome of his original trial. But James wasn't satisfied with just stopping the immediate attack. As federal agents secured the courthouse and processed the surviving attackers, James was already implementing the final phase of his plan to protect Sarah permanently. Using intelligence gathered over the previous week, James had identified the locations where key members of Castellano's organization were hiding, their financial resources, their communication networks, and their operational capabilities. Working with federal agents who now had broad authority to investigate the courthouse attack, James coordinated simultaneous raids on 15 locations across 3 states. By sunset on the day of the courthouse attack, the entire leadership structure of Castellano's organization had been either killed in the assault or arrested in the coordinated raids that followed. Their financial assets had been seized, their communication networks had been dismantled, and their ability to threaten anyone had been permanently destroyed. Vincent Castellano himself was convicted on all charges related to his original trial, plus additional charges stemming from his coordination of the courthouse attack. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and the remains of his organization were too fractured and depleted to pose a threat to anyone. 3 months later, Sarah returned to her normal routine as a court reporter, but her life had been permanently changed by the experience. She had learned that she was capable of much more courage than she had ever imagined, and she had gained a protector and friend who would remain part of her life indefinitely. James had demonstrated something that would be remembered throughout the San Diego criminal justice system for years to come. He had shown that anyone who threatened innocent civilians, court reporters, witnesses, prosecutors, or judges would face consequences that were swift, comprehensive, and devastating. "You asked me once why people fear Navy SEALs," James told Sarah as they shared coffee at the same shop where they had first met months earlier. "It's not because we're aggressive or violent. It's because we never stop, we never give up, and we never forget when someone threatens innocent people under our protection." Sarah had returned to her work with a new understanding of her role in the justice system. She wasn't just a person who typed transcripts. She was someone who helped ensure that truth was preserved and justice was served. And she knew that if anyone ever threatened her again for doing her job, they would face the full fury of someone who had dedicated his life to protecting the innocent. The story of Sarah Martinez and James Thompson became legendary within law enforcement circles, not just in San Diego, but across the country. It was a reminder that the justice system was defended by people who would go to extraordinary lengths to protect it, and that criminal organizations who thought they could intimidate court officials would discover that some protectors were more dangerous than any threat they could imagine. James continued his work in private security, but he also began training other retired military personnel to provide protection for court officials and witnesses who faced threats from criminal organizations. His message was always the same: threatening innocent civilians has consequences, and those consequences will be delivered by people who are very good at their job. For Sarah, life returned to normal in most ways, but she carried with her the knowledge that she had survived something that would have destroyed many people. She had faced professional killers, coordinated criminal organizations, and the very real possibility of death, and she had emerged stronger and more confident than ever before. Years later, when other court reporters faced similar threats, they would often hear the story of Sarah Martinez and James Thompson, the court reporter who refused to be intimidated and the Navy SEAL who made sure that anyone who threatened her understood why SEALs are feared. It became a reminder that the justice system is protected by ordinary people who can do extraordinary things when they're supported by protectors who will never back down from a fight.